Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining today's panel discussion, Everyone's Earth: Conversations on Race and the Environment, for Voices of National Leadership in Anti-Racism in the Outdoors. My name is James Edward Mills, and I'm the Community Partnerships Liaison at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And in addition to my work in outreach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I also teach a summer course called Outdoors for All. And I'm a freelance journalist and media producer and founder of the Joy Chip Project. And I will serve as the moderator for our discussion today. So this event is a collaboration with the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Cornell University and the University of Connecticut. My partners in today's effort are Laura Brown, the Associate Educator from the Department of Agriculture, Health and Natural Resources at the University of Connecticut, and Dr. Don Rakow, Associate Professor in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. We'd like to start off by acknowledging that the University of Wisconsin-Madison is located on the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place that their nation has called they joke since time immemorial. Our partners at Cornell University are located on the traditional homelands of the Gaya Coho people, also known as Cayuga Nation. Our partners at the University of Connecticut are located on lands that is the territory of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot people, and also the Eastern Pequot, and also the Passagussit, Nipmuc, and the Nipawai people. We have stewarded that land throughout generations. We acknowledge the painful history of dispossession. We honor their strength and resilience in protecting the land and aspire to uphold our responsibility according to their leadership and also to follow their example. Now, while we're disappointed that we're not able to gather today in person, we're excited for this virtual event because people from all around the world can join and learn and discuss this important topic. So the environmental movement, which has done a great deal of important work over the last few decades, is still rather limited in its reach. And when it comes to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social environmental justice. Too few communities have been included in setting the agenda, and too few communities have been able to secure educational opportunities, and too few people of color have found jobs in leadership positions in the environmental movement as well as in professional organizations. Even outdoor recreation, like the environmental movement as a whole, has been overwhelmingly white and upper middle class. Now, it is our hope in these issues and ignite conversation today. And as we kick off the event, Laura Brown and Don Rakow, I would like to share a resource with you, one that we have been working on together that is called the Antiracism in the Outdoors Resource Guide. Now, today I'm with Dr. Don Rakow. And Don, I'd like for you to share with us a little bit about the guide and give us an idea as to what the guide has to offer.
Thanks so much, James. As a bit of background, Laura and I met at some virtual conference and realized that we shared a real love of being outdoors in nature. But we also recognize that there are real and tangible barriers that people of color face in accessing the outdoors. So putting those things together, we decided to work on this guide. And while we really hope that the guide will provide new understandings, new connections around the topic of equitable access to green spaces, we also fully acknowledge and appreciate that whatever we've done has been built on the work over the past several decades by such luminary figures as Carolyn Finney, Jamaica Kincaid, Ibram Kendi, who just won a MacArthur Award, and many, many others. We really hope that the Antiracism in the Outdoors guide will serve as kind of a community commons where others can suggest additional organizations, articles, blogs, and books to include around this issue. So we thank you, James, and the Joy Trip Project for hosting the guide, and invite everyone who's part of today's event to explore it. It really should belong to everyone.
Well, Don, first of all, I'd like to thank you personally for allowing me and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Institute for Environmental Studies, as well as the Joy Trip Project, to host this amazing resource. And through the course of our conversation today, we're going to talk about what the guide can offer, but more than anything else, through the course of our conversation today, I hope that we can engage in real conversation about these important issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before we get started and introduce our three panelists, I'd like to take a moment, first of all, to thank the Schlecht Family Foundation providing honoraria for each of our speakers today. And I'm so grateful, that I have the ability to introduce the amazing individuals who are part of our panel today. I'd like to briefly introduce each of them, and I'd like to encourage you to visit the event page to learn more about them personally. First of all, my very good friend, Christopher Kilgore, is the founder of Color in the Outdoors, a DEI activity and advocacy organization focused on creating and supporting opportunities for these communities. Christopher also works with the University of Wisconsin-Madison in information technology, a multi-year pre-college prep program he helped to create and he now manages. I'd also like to introduce to you my colleague, Claudia Pineda, who is the advisor on the advisory board for Latino Outdoors, a unique natural Latinx-led organization working to create a support network for agricultural leaders in the outdoors, conservation, and nature movement. Claudia is also the sustainability manager for the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California. And finally, definitely last but not least, Karina Newsom is the community engagement manager for the Georgia Audubon Society. Karina helped to organize the inaugural Black Birders Week as a response to what happened on Memorial Day to a man by the name of Christian Cooper. Now, thank you all for joining us today. And I'd really like and would be very excited to talk to each of you. First, could I get you to take about 5 minutes to give us an introduction to your work? And just to kick us off, Karina, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James, and to everyone who has been putting this panel together. It's an honor to be featured alongside such incredible leaders and to learn from you. So thank you. Just a little bit of background around me. My name is Karina Newsom. I use she, her pronouns. I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I grew up in a pretty urban environment, but was always oriented to wildlife in particular and towards the outdoors. But it was not until I actually saw a Black woman who was a conservation professional, a wildlife professional, that I even imagined that that kind of a career path could be an option for me, that I could be a professional in that field. And so after seeing how powerful representation was, every step that I've taken in my career, going first to college, being an animal care professional, a zookeeper, then going to graduate school and learning how to do hands-on in the field wildlife conservation for birds, I began to position myself to be able to recreate that experience for other young Black women in particular. But as I have gotten closer and more have had more access essentially to the spaces of power in wildlife conservation and outdoor recreation, I've been able to see how some of the institutional structures and patterns of operations have produced what we see today, which is a largely white dominated and white centered field when it comes to outdoor recreation and when it comes to wildlife conservation and land management. What I also realized is that there are more of us out here than I could have ever imagined, because there was no, very little representation of Black people, of Indigenous people, of people of color in the outdoors, I assumed that there were not very many of us to be found. But as I've learned about people like James and Carolyn Finney and other scholars and explorers who have invested a lot into this field, I realized there is actually a massive network of people here. And ultimately, quoting one of my friends, Whitney, who I had the pleasure of meeting recently, she said, I don't want what people think about me, whether they're racist, whether they're homophobic, whatever kind of ism a person may have. I don't want what they think about me or my people to have power over me, to have power over whether or not I'm able to experience the outdoors safely, over whether or not I feel like I belong in a certain field when it comes to natural resources or wildlife conservation. And so that has kind of directed and centered the work that I do in the realm of wildlife conservation. Thank you, James.
Awesome, Karina, thank you very much. Chris, can I get you to turn your camera on and tell us about your work, please?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christopher Kilgore. I'm the founder and now coordinator of Color in the Outdoors, diversity, equity, and inclusion organization geared towards kind of a three-prong approach of getting BIPOC, LGBTQ, and differently abled humans outdoors and engaged, advocacy, and some kind of activism, if you will, with outdoor spaces, working with different organizations on the local and federal and sometimes national or international level to try to advocate for continuing to allow green spaces to remain green and accessible to all. And then thirdly, the tertiary focus of our program is to try to get the what we're calling the hook and bullet crowd, the folks that are hunter fisher people that are out there doing that sort of activity, engaged with other folks who are camping, hiking, canoeing, et cetera, because oftentimes, as we all know, there's a crossover there. And to that point, there's quite a few stereotypes and stigmas surrounding a lot of those activities. And how do we break some of those down? How do we create and continue to create spaces that are safe, welcoming, inviting, and accessible to all? I have spent my entire life in the outdoor world. I have been extremely fortunate and blessed to work with the tribal communities within the state of Wisconsin. I would be remiss not to say that I am speaking to you all currently from ancestral Ho-Chunk land here in the state of Wisconsin. And I have the pleasure and honor, as James introduced earlier, of working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working specifically with tribal communities in the Lactoflambo and Oneida communities. There are 12 tribal communities within our state. We're blessed to have such a large population. And working with them on things like stewardship and how that all folds into the initiatives that Color in the Outdoors are doing. So thanks to James for this opportunity. Thanks to everyone else on the panel. It's an honor to be here with everyone today, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Great, Chris, thank you. And Claudia, can we get you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Pineda Tibbs. My pronouns are they, them. And I am currently speaking to you all from the occupied land of the Northern Pomo. And I will share a little bit about myself and how I came to love being in the outdoors. I grew up in Southern California in Southgate near Compton, and spent some time in nature. I think the way that I identified with nature was whatever was around me that was green or that had little creepy collies. So my front yard was nature. My favorite time of the year was after it rained and all of the clovers would pop up and the mushrooms would pop up and small insects would just show themselves instead of being buried underground. And the outdoors for me was a special place that I spent time with my family and my extended family when we would go camping. And our kind of camping was very different than the kind of camping I'm doing right now this week with my husband. And it was more of a group setting of camping, and it was about the people that you were with and you happened to be outdoors rather than being with the outdoors first. And that sense of being in the outdoors felt very much as though our community was coming with us wherever we were. And it wasn't until I was in high school where I was very fortunate to have a fantastic environmental science teacher who cared a lot about her students and really wanted us to strive to pursue our passions. And she knew that my passion was the environment. And in her class, as a result of being in that course, I was able to go camping for the first time, not with my family, to a national state park. Or to a national park, I mean, and the first time I was on a boat, the first time I went kayaking, that experience at the Channel Islands was very formative for me, and it laid the groundwork for my career in ocean conservation. So my degree is in environmental science, or ocean, or I'm like, wow, am I forgetting what I studied? Marine and coastal ecology. And it wasn't until getting into that field that I saw that nobody really looked like me. My friend Erica and I were the only two people of color in our entire courses that we were enrolled in, and that just continued as a trend throughout my career. And where I did see folks of color was really more in the environmental education space, because there were initiatives targeted at increasing outreach and education for folks of color. But I didn't see that in the scientists that were addressing my students. I didn't see that in the staff who were working towards policy issues. And I didn't see that in especially the boards that were advising the different organizations I was working with. So, or even in the organizations that were leading the work that I was involved in. So I feel very fortunate to be on the board of advisors for Latino Outdoors, where we inspire, connect, and engage Latino communities in the outdoors and embrace cultura, familia as part of our outdoor narrative, and ensuring that our history, our heritage, our leadership are valued and represented. And with Latino Outdoors, we strive to build a safe, inclusive, and welcoming place where we can continue to grow that leadership as an active community of outdoor users, mentors, and stewards. And I would say that it's a privilege to serve in that capacity and to be able to use some of that authority in some of the work that I do in my own community as a parks commissioner in my county, thinking about my experience, folks who are not always represented, to ensure that there is equity amongst the access that people have to outdoor spaces, and to ensure that advocacy also involves or also includes programmatic funds to ensure that the gap towards accessing the outdoor spaces can be as narrow as possible. So thanks for having me here.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you all for being here. And we have a great audience. We have over 680 people on the webinar right now. Just so everyone knows, this is being recorded, and it is also being live streamed to YouTube at this very moment. What I'd like to do is to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to ask their questions in the chat, both using either the Q&A feature or the live chat stream. These questions will be moderated, and they will be sent to me, and where appropriate, I will ask them to our panelists. But to get started, I'd like to begin this conversation with something just a tad personal, and many of you in our discussion so far have already shared with us the first introduction that you had personally to the outdoors. What I'd really love is to begin a conversation around why is it so important for there to be that initial point of contact, that initial moment in the outdoors that begins one's interest in environmental conservation, especially as it pertains to segments of the population that might not have those experiences until much later in life. And typically that includes people of color and other marginalized communities. It's a big question, but if you can give me an idea personally, why is it important to you to have that first initial experience in the outdoors? Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to start.
Go ahead, Claudia.
I'm happy to start. And for me, I see this based off of my experience as an outdoor educator, an environmental educator as well, in that having access to the outdoors, I think it really gives you perspective that you are part of a larger system. And it's not just, you know, my home and my community, but the greater environment. And having those experiences in the outdoors and the environment there it lends itself for somebody to build their environmental identity and think about their environmental narrative, and when have they had experiences in the outdoors, in nature, and what has it given them, and to be able to reflect on that and think about not only, and I know that this is like huge, and so it's not going to happen just in one experience, but the ecosystem services that the environment provides us with, the benefits to our mental health and our physical health in being outdoors, and the fact that we gain so much from the environment gives the opportunity for the individual to think about wanting to protect what they love. So building that environmental identity then allows for bridging those moments in the outdoors to advocacy and to build an identity towards being an environmental advocate and being able to support policies that protect those outdoor and environmental nature spaces. So I would say that just those formative experiences in the outdoors can lend itself to being an advocate of protection of those spaces, and to then take it even one step further, become your own advocate in your community, in your county, in your state, to ensure that those opportunities are equitable to more people beyond the dominant culture, beyond the overrepresented culture that we see in marketing, so that it truly becomes a space for all people to participate in and to have access to.
Awesome, thank you. Karina, Chris, would you have anything to add to that?
I think the importance of that essentially kind of spark moment, I think primarily from the perspective of someone who is from and lives in a low income environment, there can be a lot of stress that comes with the daily life of a person who is in a low wealth community, of a person who does not have access to all the resources that they need to thrive. And the nature to which we are connected and on which we depend is a very, in theory, should be an easily accessible source of healing in many ways, of relieving the burden that comes with marginalization. But what you see instead is that the people who are the most marginalized, that have the least access to the resources that they need to thrive, and the stress that comes with that, oftentimes also, especially in urban environments like where I grew up, are least connected and have the least access to the healing that comes with being outside. And that dynamic, that combination is so incredibly unhealthy and damaging. And so when a person is able to have, no matter where in life, if they're young kids, which is, especially is wonderful, or if they're adults, right, older adults even, when they are able to have that initial connection and that initial spark, that essentially propels them forward into their own healing. And as Claudia was mentioning, their own story in the outdoors, but I think it also kind of mobilizes people to essentially engage the people around them, their community, in place-based investment, place-based learning, place-based connection. Because I think one of the, when it comes to outdoor recreation, one of the most effective and one of the ways that I try to engage communities now as a professional in this field is thinking about where is it that you live? Because oftentimes we're taught to think that the outdoors or nature is someplace far away that we have to travel far to get to. but the more that you can draw people's attention to what they have right where they are, and the detail and the beauty and the systems and the cycles that exist where they are, that increases their access to that healing that it can provide, but also to everything that Claudia mentioned about their involvement with advocacy, their involvement with education, whatever it might be, but investing in place-based learning and connection.
And Chris, I know that you and I have personally helped people with their very first outdoor experience. Why is that important?
Well, I mean, I don't want to just repeat what was said so incredibly eloquently already, but I will, I guess, piggyback on what was said and add to that, and in that, so often we hear, and James, to your point of conversations and outings that we've held, we hear folks that say, I'm just not an outdoors person. And I said, the irony to me is that every single time you walk outside, you're outdoors. Every time you're on your porch, you're outdoors. That is an outdoor space. And even, along with that, to have that first aha moment of understanding the place and space in which you occupy. We have this conversation earlier, acknowledging the land on which you stand. But to that point, then acknowledging the space that you occupy, right? And I hate to use the occupy word, but in conjunction with what we spoke of earlier. There's that additional conversation about, well, you are a steward of this space. I don't like to use the word owner, but definitely as soon as you go outside, you're outdoors. And so technically we're all on some level outdoors folks, because we are going from point A to B in the outdoor world, and then taking that moment to again, kind of echo what was already said, to acknowledging what it is that is outdoors. Historically speaking, you don't hear people say, you know what, I'm going to go take a sit down on the couch to relax. It's usually, I'm going to go take a walk. Why don't you go get some fresh air? It is usually not replaced with, why don't you go get some smog? So these are all already kind of inherently healing, relaxing, energizing things that people have done and continue to do. And again, to the points that were made previously, and Karina made most recently, is when you have a group of folks who have essentially been on so many levels, oppressed, marginalized, underrepresented, let's go down the list of those different descriptions. Oftentimes, it does take a moment or five to allow folks to get out of their own head and out of their own space and those barriers that they've carried with them, to understand that this is a space that is occupied by them and can be enjoyed by them, and then by us as a larger collective. And I think it is only until that point, until that aha moment of, I have the right to be here just like everyone else does. And I have the ability to be here just like everyone else does. And in light of that, I want this to be something I can pass along. I can pass this enjoyable aha epiphanous moment onto whomever. And in the process of doing that, I need to make sure that it stays the space that created this energy for me. And so that's where the activism and the advocacy and stewardship really comes into play. And I think that that's, whether you're 4 years old and you have that aha moment when you realize a butterfly is not going to eat your face, or whether you're 90 years old and you realize suddenly that this isn't as obstructive or as imposing a space as it might seem from a distance. I think that all of those light bulbs that go on continue to brighten the future moving forward.
Awesome. Well, I think a big part of all of this is the communal aspect of this, and much of the work that we collectively do can be intersectional. And I think I'm really curious to know now, who are your partners, or who are the people or organizations that you most share this work with? Karina, I'll start with you. Who are you working with, and how are you collaborating in order to create opportunities to get more people of color in the outdoors?
Yeah, so I believe particularly, and I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm the community engagement manager at Georgia Audubon, as James mentioned in the introduction. And so a lot of my work lies at the intersection of conservation and outdoor recreation, and rooting all of that in equity. And so my biggest partners in that work, being someone who prioritizes community and understanding that most solutions are local. The future is local, I believe, when it comes to solutions, as one of my friends, Melody Zhang, said. But my biggest partners are entities like neighborhood planning units here in Atlanta, which is occupied Muskogee Creek historical ancestral lands. They are the city parks, the friends groups that are managing and stewarding and advocating for the city parks in Black and brown neighborhoods here in Atlanta. And because they are already organized around addressing issues of inequity in their communities, in their neighborhoods, on their block, they already have the trust of their community. They're already plugged in. They know exactly what the priorities are for their community. So instead of me coming in, someone from Philadelphia coming to Atlanta and saying, hey, I think you all would have a great time doing X, Y, and Z. Instead, I go to them and I listen and I say, what are the ways that you currently connect with your park? What are the ways that you currently enjoy and use the space, this outside space in your neighborhood, right? And then I let them know what resources I have available. Hey, I've got binoculars. I'm a wildlife biologist. We have these resources. We have these funds. And together we create opportunities that are relevant for that community and relevant for the spaces that they enjoy. And so they are, and always will be, I believe, the most important partners in the work of getting people, communities, individuals in the outdoors and connected with their spaces. And one thing that I always want to say is that I think a lot of times people assume that people are disconnected all the time, that people are not connected with their outdoor space, when in fact, people are oftentimes connected, not in the ways that we think of traditionally. Maybe they're not bird watchers, maybe they're not kayakers, right? But they like to be outside, they like to be in their parks, figuring out what they already do and plugging whatever you have to offer into their already existing connections.
Awesome. Claudia, what would you add to that? Who are your partners and how do you work together?
Yeah, thank you. Similar to Karina, for Latino Outdoors, it is the community. And even though Latino Outdoors is based out of California and the Bay Area, the work that we do on a national level is because there are folks who are saying, hey, I know that there's more than just me out here who wants to be in the outdoors, but I want us to gather as basically an affinity group to do that. And it's our Latino Outdoors leaders who are really a part of that community, who are developing programs that are reflective of the community that they live in. And so whenever you see an outing that Latino Outdoors is putting together, it's based off of the interests of that community in that space. And so that's getting folks to come outdoors, to come outside, to have a facilitated experience, whether it is a walk, whether it is birding, whether it is an introduction to backpacking, whatever it might be. And I do want to mention that, yes, being outdoors, just like I am right now in front of the public library, is outdoors. I see trees around me. And so what we're trying to do is not only make that connection of you have nature in your community, but also if you want to see what else is out there, if you want to go to a state park, if you want to go to a national park, let's scaffold that for people so that they feel comfortable being in that space, if that's what they want to aspire to do. Additionally, some of our other partners are larger entities and other NGOs like Green Latinos. They advocate for clean ocean, clean air. Similar to Latino Outdoors, it is in the interest of those communities that the basically volunteers of Green Latinos will bring forward to the greater national organization so that we can have advocacy around issues that disproportionately affect communities of color. And another partner is the Hispanic Access Foundation based out of Washington, D.C. They're a fantastic organization that is not only working to bring awareness of Latinos and their connection to the ocean, but to the outdoors, their space in the advocacy field, in addition to a lot of other ways that we can grow as leaders in our communities rather than continue to just serve as a constituent. So those are a few of our partners that we work with.
Great. And Chris, who are your partners and how do you work together?
Well, the partnership kind of runs a wide gambit. I'm working with city organizations like the city parks in Madison. I've also been talking to Dane County Parks at the county level. I'm working out here in the Dodge County area with some of the natural spaces out here with Horicon Marsh, Horicon Marsh being one of the larger wetland preserves in the entire area. Working with the State Department of Natural Resources, state parks, the Department of Outdoor Recreation, that's a separate division within the state of Wisconsin. Also working on partnerships with groups like Pheasants Forever, National Wild Turkey Federation, and now starting to work on really intentionally connecting and collaborating with community centers in a whole variety of different communities. Again, because there are kids all over, and there are folks of all ages all over that definitely would like to spend time outside. Some folks have and continue to want to expand their horizons, and others are just getting into it or just understanding kind of, oh, this is something I could do, and how do they find someone to connect with in those capacities. And I think to that point, I've had and I know everyone on this panel, including yourself, you and I have spoken about this numerous times. There are so many different organizations out there, especially now based on some of our unfortunate history in recent months and years, that are trying, and I'll use that word trying, to do some work in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion, and specific again to the outdoors and the outdoor industry. And I would say that, oftentimes in those conversations, there's a lot of people that kind of get into how can we help? And we start to have that conversation. And oftentimes, and I would be willing to bet there's going to be a lot of head nods when I say this next, but oftentimes folks say, yeah, that sounds great, but that's not in our budget right now. And of course, my admitted kind of snarky response is, well, then it's not as serious as you say it is to you. Because if indeed these things are initiatives that you were wanting to be involved in, that you're saying that you want to take some sort of active role and active sort of participant partnership with various other organizations across the country and around the world, then you would find funding for it. And that's always a sticky conversation, and it's always an uncomfortable one, but this conversation is a sticky and uncomfortable one. And I think that that's something that folks really need to kind of come out of their protective barriers from, and kind of acknowledge that this is something that needs to happen. And so from a partnership perspective, I will also say that I'm extremely cautious about who I say I am or am not in partnership or collaboration with, because there's a lot of folks that I'm talking to, and a lot of individuals send emails and messages and have meetings. But then the real question at the end of the day is who is indeed moving forward with that idea of donating equipment and gear and time and resource, and most specifically to what we're talking about, money, to these different organizations and these different initiatives, and not on we've done it once, we got a plaque, we put it on our website, let's move forward kind of way, but a genuinely, how can we make this a sustainable long-term investment that for generations to come, using 7 generations from my indigenous communities and brothers and sisters about how we look 7 generations ahead in what we do and how we plan in order to make sure that those generations ahead are being taken care of and are continuing to thrive based on our actions now.
Well, that's almost a really good anticipation of my next question, because frankly, during COVID, and also especially through the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the recent events regarding the incident in Central Park with Christian Cooper, the death of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, how do we make sure that the work that we do is indeed longitudinal, in the sense that it is long-lasting and sustainable? And what are our best efforts to be able to move this conversation forward past the rhetoric of this being a good idea right now because of our current cultural and social unrest that we're experiencing as a country right now? What's the best way to make sure that we make the outdoors more accessible for more people well into the future? Karina, can I ask you that question?
Yes, you can. And I'm so glad you asked, James, because this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, talking a lot about, and trying to make movement when it comes to the field that I occupy, which is a narrow one, bird conservation, wildlife management, and outdoor recreation that aligns with wildlife viewing. When it comes to longitudinal movement and progress forward and sustained progress, we can't try to look for silver bullet solutions for silver plated problems, as Dr. Drew Lanham says. What we need to be doing is redistributing power. A lot of times we hear organizations and individuals using phrases like, oh, I want to use my privilege to help X, Y, or Z, or for the purpose of equity or diversity or inclusion. The point, though, is not to reinforce your privilege, to reinforce the position that you're in, but rather for you to no longer have that privilege. That's what we want, right? When it comes to kind of what Christopher was talking about when it comes to money and people actually putting their money behind when, you know, their words, particularly when they say words like equity, which it seems as though people don't really understand the gravity of the word equity and what that actually looks like operationally. I've seen, and I was recently talking about this with several friends, including people who I work with, when it comes to some of these philanthropic efforts, right? Okay, these foundations now making all this money available for efforts and programs around Black, Indigenous communities of color in the outdoors and connecting with nature. They talk all this talk around these programs that are happening that we're funding must be equitable. Equity is the foundation. It has to be embedded, while at the same time making the granting process totally inaccessible by those communities, right? So doing the work, almost like a fake hustle, as Jason Collins says, he's a wildlife photographer. We are seeing people doing all this movement, but continuing to reinforce who has the power, who has the money, and who does not. You might give out millions of dollars for equity, but if you're giving them all to white institutions, wealthy institutions who've already had the resources to then trickle it down to communities of color, that's not equity. That's not equitable. But people feel satisfied with those actions. And so instead, directly injecting the resources into the communities who are oftentimes already organized around addressing the inequities that they're experiencing is how you create long-lasting, meaningful change that actually realizes the world that we want to see, people from these communities, what we want to see. Looking at equity for what it actually is, and not just, as you said, either Christopher James, putting a plaque, right? Doing a thing, putting a plaque up and moving on.
More than anything else, we're in an environment where we're trying to figure out what we can do beyond the pro forma exercise of spending money, giving grants, but again, sending that money primarily to white-led organizations. I can ask that same question to you, Claudia. I mean, what can we do to be able to more effectively encourage longitudinal change that is indeed sustainable?
Yeah, I think Karina just laid it out for everyone, like, conversation over, let's go home now. But I would add to that, which is amazing what you just said, Karina, that shifting of the power. I think that's where organizations also need to look within themselves and identify where it is that they are continuing to hold power and not allow for that equity to truly happen. And I would say a responsibility of organizations is to ensure that they're looking at their leadership structure, their board structure, and who does it represent. So if you have a lot of very wealthy folks of the dominant culture, of white culture, who are continuing to say, well, let's basically just throw money at the problem and call it a day, but not necessarily change the structure of their leadership or the board, then I think that's going to continue to be an issue. And you won't truly get at equity within that organization. So it's also shifting of power to ensure that there are people from the community able to achieve leadership within that organization. And it's also a matter of thinking beyond well, we want to hire somebody who can hit the ground running. I don't understand that to begin with. You know, how is somebody going to truly understand a organization if they aren't given the opportunity to understand the history, to understand the mistakes of the organization, to understand what the organization wants to achieve, and to be their authentic selves and to say, here's what I here's what I would like to contribute, or here's what I see as an opportunity. And you're not going to have that if you continue to have a leadership structure that is based off of hierarchy, that is, you know, focused on, well, this is the way that we've always done it. So I think you can get at diverse perspectives from people who are fresh out of college, who have a background that is completely different from the organization that you work with. But as long as people align with the mission and the vision of an organization, then I think that's where you can get some really interesting synergy coming to help identify those mistakes that the organization maybe has made in the past. And the last thing that I would mention as well is, again, just, and I'm hung up on what Karina said in terms of, you know, yes, I understand I come from a place of privilege, that phrase. There are lots of folks like me who are people of color who experience privilege. I have way more privilege because I am a lighter shade of brown. And so where does it fall on us as people of color who have privilege to additionally advocate for those of our brothers and sisters and our family members who haven't had that opportunity, who haven't had that their voices be heard? So it's not just white folks who are of the dominant culture and who are of the overrepresented culture, but also those of us who experience additional privilege. If we can bear the emotional labor, let's do it, because that's how we are going to shift. That's how we're going to rock the boat, and how we're going to change the system. So that's something that I would just mention for all of us.
Well, I want to remind everyone that you have the opportunity to share your questions in both the Q&A and the chat functions. Also, please take them time to visit the Areto guide online. I'm going to quick jump into the questions from the audience because this is actually directly related to what we're talking about. One of the viewers asks, I'm a white person. Is the message here that I should give my money and get out of the way? And I'm curious to know, is that what we're saying? You know, that we should essentially allow our white allies or white-led organizations to contribute to our efforts and just get out of the way?
I'll take part of this one. I think everyone is like, oh, I don't know if I want to dive into this one. So I would say that the answer to that question is not binary. I don't think it's a yes or no answer. I think it's perhaps a yes and, depending on where we are, what the arena is, what the circumstances are, and in others it's a no and. But I don't think I would ever necessarily say one or the other at the opposite extreme. I think that there's some absolute necessity for acknowledging one's, again, place and space. And I think that to ask that question of, should I give money and just get out of the way? I guess it depends on where you're standing. If you are in a white-led organization that is in a dominant culture that is taking the lion's share of resource and credit for whatever it is that we're speaking about directly, then perhaps that is exactly what needs to happen, is that there needs to be some funding handed to someone else. And instead of you then trying to take ownership for that funding being handed down, let somebody else be the owner of that money and continue, or resource, and continue to move forward with it. I think in other cases, there's a partnership, there's a collaboration, and that's absolutely imperative for the survival of the species. And I'll just use my anthropological or scientific mind for a minute there and say, we absolutely still need to be working together. This is a harmonious relationship. This is not an absolute siloed or individual lane event. However, to some points that were made earlier about affinity groups, I think it is also incredibly important for folks to be able to have their own spaces, to feel safe within said spaces, to feel that there is that agency and ownership of that space. And there I use that O word again, but to be in charge of one's space, one's place, and to feel comfortable at being at the helm. And so I'll use that analogy of having a seat at the table. And unless you have a plate, a fork, a knife, a spoon, a cup, and a meal at the table, then you're just sitting there taking up space. And so to that point, if you are indeed going to be sharing, breaking bread, whatever metaphor you want to use for that analogy, then it needs to be in a way that everyone has at the end of the day, a full stomach and feels as though they had a good meal. Or we make our own table, or in some cases, depending on what, again, being sensitive to cultures, we may not have a table at all. We may all just be sitting around in a circle having this conversation and eating whatever the meal of the day is, and we all need to be kind of aware of how that works. So I'm sorry, that was a very long-winded way of answering it really does depend, but I think that there is that uncomfortable truth of the matter that there are indeed going to be times where that is absolutely what will happen.
Ladies, anything to add? I know it's a very tough question, but Chris, thank you very much for a very candid but very helpful answer. Because we really do need to create allyship with all of this. We need to have real collaboration, and that means yielding power when need be, but it also means sharing power and working collaboratively more often than not. So our next question, I'm curious because this whole program was actually put together by university scholars. Much of the resources and the information that we're sharing in the Arito Guide are part of things that are happening on college campuses around the country. In your opinion, what can universities or institutions of higher learning do to help move this conversation forward, to be able to use both intellectual and scientific research in order to better understand the nature of the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion in the outdoors that we're trying to solve? Claudia, I'll bounce that question to you.
Sure, thank you. I can't help but think of what Karina said earlier and place-based education. I mean, when my work at the aquarium, when I was working in the education division, that's what we did a lot of. And I feel as though there's a part of me that resonated so much with what we were doing with our education programs at our aquarium as a nonprofit that felt just like the experience I had when I was an undergrad. And it was because our learning was happening outdoors. And in my undergrad years, I was maybe outdoors equal amount of time as I was in a classroom setting. And that was so important because it allowed me to better understand the ecosystem in my local community, but it also allowed me to think more about the places that I wanted to take my now husband to when I was out in the field and like, oh, I'm going to take Ryan tide pooling. I want to go here. Or I want to show him this really cool view from when we were doing this transect in our ecosystems class. And I feel as though universities, especially those who have programs that are near outdoor settings to get their students outside, get their learners outside. Also connect with the local community, and perhaps there's an opportunity for those undergraduate students or graduate students to also connect with students in the pre-K to 12th grade system and serve as facilitators of an outdoor experience to those younger students. And I would also say that there's an opportunity for universities and colleges to just broaden the perspectives of folks who are a part of the community, just neighbors, residents, and perhaps bestow some of that academic insight, those academic insights to folks in the community so that they can, if they are interested, learn a little bit more about their ecosystems. But I know at my university as well, we had an outdoor program where you could check out camping gear if you wanted to go camping. So serving as a resource, not only for students, but for the community, I think could help remove some barriers as well for folks who just might not have that gear because of financial issues, or for us, space issues. We live in a very small house because that's all we can afford in the community that we live in because it's so expensive. So I think there's a lot to be said of universities as hubs for the community, not just for the students, not just for the faculty, but for the community itself.
Well, James, you're muted, but I was looking with you just to piggyback off what Claudia said. I think, so again, my background in academia is wildlife management, wildlife science, field biology. A lot of the pattern of operation around that kind of study of the outdoors, of nature, takes a bit of a colonizer pattern of behavior where you go into a community, a place that you're not from, where nobody knows who you are, and you do your research and then you get out, right? Or you stay there for a long time, depending on what the context is. But there's not ever a connection, it seems, or very rarely connection with the people whose land you are on, whose space you are taking up as you're conducting your research. And so I think that when it comes to the practice of academics, the practice of study, engaging the community where you are studying the birds or the mollusks or the grass, right? The places where you're doing this academic work, getting to know the people there and making the resource that you have available to them, because institutions like universities have an incredibly amount of concentrated resources in money, in expertise, in physical tools like binoculars and scopes and ways to explore the environment that the average person doesn't have. And especially if you're in a place that is a low wealth community, a marginalized or oppressed community. And instead of going in there and being extractive, going in there to take information without ever sharing what you have to offer with the people, even for example, like when you're hiring field techs, right? Most field biology, most study of the outdoors involves you hiring either undergrads or young people to help you. Instead of simply and like essentially specifically and only looking at the student population, go into the community and see, is there someone who would like a summer job going out helping you with your research and opening up access to that space so that they can get that experience and get that training and maybe be able to enter that field one day themselves if they are so interested. So kind of engaging the community and being very intentional to make the resources that you have available to them as much as possible. But when it comes to the learning experience, even of students in the classroom, and I've experienced this, I went to Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia, which is rural Georgia in South Georgia. And there has been repeatedly such a visceral and sometimes violent response from students when they were confronted with even the slightest different perspective around equity, around people's experiences with racism in the outdoors, right? They had never been exposed to it, and they had massive reactions that were dangerous for other students of color on campus. And so it just pointed to how incredibly important it is, not even starting with college, of course, but especially in college, these formative years, that you are integrating the history of non-white people, of non-dominant culture people and communities that interact with what you study, because there is a history there. And will you have to go out of your way to know what that is? Yes, you will, especially if you're not from that community or from that background. So integrating communities into the practice of science and integrating communities into the sharing of knowledge about the field in which you specialize. So that's what I would offer about universities.
Well said. Chris, you're a university guy. How do we do more as a campus community to be able to move these conversations forward?
I think that, I can speak specific to the educational institution within which I work, and I've worked with a lot of other colleges and universities around the country on various partnership levels, and I can say that one of the biggest things is just acknowledging that this is the thing, and having this conversation and saying, because what we often hear is that there's this kind of a marketing approach to like, hey, we really like you to do this. Hey, we'd really like you to be involved in this. And hey, this is something we want you to. And I think that there's a pause that needs to take place where organizations as a whole and institutions say, okay, I know what it seems like, or I know what it's been like, or I know what our history, what our track record is. Here's where we're trying to do better. Here's where we're trying to do different. And here are the steps to the points that were made earlier that we're taking to make that something that's sustainable. I think by having staff, faculty on board who do look like folks that you're trying to engage with and be involved with and partner with, having to that very point, and I totally agree with what Karina was saying as far as going out into the communities and having these conversations and trying to, in many ways, engage with folks that you wouldn't necessarily, because we do as an institution oftentimes get kind of stuck in our own little world. You know, the University of Wisconsin-Madison using us as a specific spot. I mean, we're our own city. We've got 40,000+ humans walking around campus at any given time. So often you lose track of what's across the street, let alone what's in the community as a whole and the surrounding region. So I think that being able to have those conversations and not turning it into that point that was made earlier also of a research project, not having the specialists walking into a community and saying, from an anthropological perspective, we're studying this community in order to find out what their ways are and use the language that they're familiar with in order to have nomenclature that makes them feel inviting, blah, blah, blah. Stop with the nonsense and let's have a real time and real talk conversation with folks. And to that point, again, that was made, and I'm totally piggybacking. I apologize if it sounds like mansplaining, because that is not at all what I'm trying to do right now. But really, to that point of saying, what can we do for these communities in which we work versus here's what we're going to do. Here's our limited scope in which we're going to provide this resource or this support, and you have to follow suit with whatever that protocol is versus, you know, maybe we are not coming at this in a lens that is in any way, shape, or form actually something that could be a collaborative partnership because of our inability. I mean, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, and being able to have that real talk conversation is, I think, incredibly important on a very grassroots level before even kind of, and again, there's a whole truckload of hierarchies within the institutions of higher learning. We know this. So we need to start at square one and work our way up and through the ranks in order to make sure that we're not just preaching to said metaphorical choir, but we're actually having conversations with all levels, with all folks involved at the same time.
James, you're muted.
Sir. Yeah, I was pressing my space bar that should have released my mute button, but I'm just going to head and do it manually. We had several really great questions coming in the Q&A function, as well as in the chat screen. We also had a lot of questions that were sent in with your registrations, and I'm going to ask a few of those now. In the meantime, please, we literally have 36 questions in the Q&A queue right now. If you have a question, please go ahead and put it in, but also upvote the questions that you most would like to have asked. They're actually being ranked in terms of most interest, and those are the questions that I'm more likely to ask because of the audience interest. But we're going to go into the advanced questions, and I'm curious to know, so how can we convert performative action into real change? You know, I think a lot of us have seen some interesting demonstrations of both outrage and also demonstration of the need or desire to have things happen. We've seen a lot of marches, a lot of sign waving, a lot of protests, but how can that be actually converted into change? And what does that change look like? Claudia?
That's a tough one. I mean, I feel like it's a difficult question to answer because there have been so many great things already suggested. So I don't want to repeat myself, but I think just looking at also the optics of your organization, your university, whatever it is that you're representing, and looking at the communications of what it is the group that you represent. So for example, there was a lot of, I would say, performative action happening last year on social media. And you either were doing it right or you were doing it wrong. And there were a lot of folks who were making statements and putting statements out there in support of Black Lives Matter. And that's great on the surface, but what exactly were you doing? And I think there were a lot of organizations who realized that they were being performative and they were actually putting their money where their mouth is and doing a lot of the great things that we mentioned earlier in terms of setting aside funds to increase diversity in specific fields, like in the marine science field or in the field conservation areas of environmentalism. And also people were putting out diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and justice statements out there. And I think that's great, because the more that you can be explicit about those goals, then the more people can hold you and your organization accountable. And I think a lot of us have experience with doing the internal work at our organization. But if it just happens internally and it's never discussed or addressed outside of the walls of our organization, then that feels very performative. If there's no data to support how those goals and objectives are making progress, then again, that's just a lot of, well, here's what I wish our organization would do, and you're not actually doing the work. So I would say, reporting out on those ways in which organizations, universities are doing better than they have in the past would go a long way to ensure or to demonstrate that it's not just we're saying what people want us to say, but we're actually committed to being a part of the change.
Thank you. Karina, please.
Yeah, so when it comes to performative responses, the hallmark, I think, of performative action is action or words without relationship. And I think the foundation of any sort of work in equity, regardless of where your heart is or how great or true your intentions are, if you are not in relationship and actively and continuously building trust with the communities and the demographics where you are, your best intended actions, your best intended words will not actually yield the results that are needed for the communities that you are hoping to have equitable interactions with, or equitable engagement with. And that takes time, right? That's you literally going to somebody's house or meeting somebody for lunch and sitting down and talking to people. A lot of people want, a lot of kind of like numbers and kind of these metrics that you can tout up and put on websites to say this number of Black people or brown people came to this and this, that's cool. And you need those numbers, but you have to be able to craft programming and craft initiatives and craft efforts that are following the lead of the communities who have been experiencing the marginalization. And you can't do that if you don't know them. You can't do that if you don't know what they care about or what their priorities are or what they've already done to address the issue and how you can support. And so I would say to avoid that kind of performative industrial complex that we're kind of in right now, set aside time and money. You end up have people in your inbox like, do we have enough money to pay for your investment in community building and relationship? Well, put the time and the money there so that you can have people who are building individual relationships with communities. And I think that is the bedrock of even beginning to think in an equitable framework.
Wow. Yeah, and I got to tell you, you had mentioned earlier that there are no silver bullet solutions to silver-plated problems. And I think that a lot of people are operating under the presumption that they can just do one thing and everything will be fine, or do a series of things. But I think that it's really important that we really do build solid relationships with within the very organizations that we're both trying to impact, but also to empower. And I think that it's really not going to be until we take the time to develop these relationships that any of that's going to change. In the time that we've got left, I'd like to address some of our community questions that were asked. And I'm literally going to go in order as they have been upvoted. Our first question: I'm a white woman who works as a volunteer land steward. We host work days and hike outs, but despite being in an urban area, have had difficulty reaching the communities of color aside from school groups. What can I do as a white woman to change this? I apologize for my ignorance, and I greatly appreciate you hosting these conversations as a place for me to learn. So how can our white allies, especially those that are doing this work, and this is a very specific question, with regard to how do we engage audiences within, especially urban communities, to to do this work, what can white people do to create more space for people in the outdoors? Chris, what do you think?
Well, I think that asking those questions is obviously a first step. I mean, it's saying, hey, I don't know and I want to know. And I think, again, kind of acknowledging one's space and privilege, and then understanding that that can be either a tool or a weapon, and then being able to have that conversation with groups that are in the community. So, you know, I say this kind of tongue in cheek, so I apologize. I'm in no way, shape, or form trying to be offensive, but there is Google, right? And there are all kinds of organizations, just to use the central Wisconsin-Madison area as an example. There are quite a few different organizations that are doing work with communities of color that would be interested in collaborating. And I think that there are quite a few spaces. James, you and I have spoken to and about many of these spaces within that area that all say the same thing. They all say, hey, we've got this resource, we've got this thing, but we can't seem to engage with. And I said, well, how are you trying to engage, and with whom? And I think that that's another conversation. And the other thing to that point, like, how can we as a blank group engage with a blank group? My number one response to any of those questions is be uncomfortable and be ready for that. I think that that's the other thing, is that there's still this want, desire, this need to function within safe space, or to function within what one considers to be safe for themselves. And you know, there's that golden versus platinum rule. The golden rule being do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the platinum rule, which I really encourage people to follow, is do unto others as they would like to have done unto them. And so you're not working within your own parameters, you're working within the parameters of the folks you're trying to engage with. And I think that that's how, to answer that question, one can engage with an organization, a community, a culture that is not their own, is to really understand by reaching out and saying, I don't want to come at this from my lens. I want to try to at least understand your lens, or at least talk to folks who can, and not just one person as a representative, but the community as a representative.
Can I add one thing to that? I know I just spoke, but
Go right ahead.
Christopher, so I think I get that question a lot from people. Like, there's this kind of white dominated space or entity or organization, and there's an adjacent, Black or brown community, but we can't seem to get them to come to our things or engage with us. I think oftentimes, and obviously it depends on the context, but these entities, these white dominated groups, expect people who don't know who they are and have no reason to trust these spaces or these groups to come to where they are, as opposed to you going to where they are with permission, of course, right? So instead of that being your first, step, or your first metric of success, go to them, and as Christopher was saying, and as I had said before, building trust with that community, right? So they know who you are. And then after you have positioned yourself to support what they're doing, to learn from them, it should always start with listening and learning. Then we can even begin to think about having them trust you enough to come into your space, right? Because there are reasons why, depending on what the entity is or the organization is, especially when it comes to outdoor related topics and groups, there can be a whole list of reasons why there's distrust there and separation there. So going first to the community, as opposed to first expecting them to come to you, is what I would add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love what someone had said in the chat, that it's really important that we take the time to build a relationship first. And the mentality of build it and they will come doesn't work unless you people know that they are invited and welcome to come and to be there. And I think that's something that we've failed to do as organizations that are directed towards environmental protection. We've made these spaces open technically for everybody, but the reality is that they're only open to those people that are aware that they even exist, that have the capacity and the resources to be able to enjoy these things. Anything else anyone would like to add before we move on to the next question? Okay. As a former state wildlife agency employee, I've seen the narrative of people of color don't want these jobs get in the way of agencies addressing the systematic exclusion of people of color from wild spaces throughout history. What recommendations do you have to overcome this narrative to help states diversify their employee pool and constituent relationships. So I'm sure we've all heard that. You know, people of color don't want these jobs. People of color don't want to come to these spaces. We don't have very many Black employees. How do we fix that? How do we change the narrative around the reality that we're all experiencing? Claudia.
Yeah, those are just empty words with not a lot of, data to support that. And I think there needs to be almost like a root cause analysis of people of color don't want these jobs, locations, and how do you know that? Is that in some actual data? So how are you recruiting for those jobs as well? Because I can tell you there have been plenty of times when I've thought, how cool would it be to just like work at a park? And I don't know how much it pays, but I could live there. Like, that'd be amazing. And I think that there are a lot of us, especially in Latino Outdoors, who have thought about that, but we might not be able to afford to do that because we don't have generational wealth. We didn't get to go to college for free. Some of us didn't. We had to like hustle and pay our own way for our education. So it's unrealistic to say people of color don't want these jobs without knowing that a lot of us don't come from money and we don't have a safety net with our family members that they're gonna, that we were born into money to be able to pay for all of those things in order to get at a quote unquote level playing field, because it's never going to be level. And then in terms of people of color just don't want to come to these places, we already addressed that in terms of if you build it, they will come. Like, that's just not true if you're not building that relationship. And thank you, Karina, for initially bringing up the point of relationship and how important it is. So I think it's just a lot of reassessing of, yeah, agree, unpaid internships should be illegal. Pay the people to do the job. Pay so that people not only have a living wage and can sustain food, shelter, but also pay for their debt. And then there's the whole other systemic issue of, ensuring that education is free as well. But we're not there at this point. That's not the point of this conversation. But the thing to continue to unpack is a lot of people don't come from generational wealth. So you can't assume that paying people the bare minimum is going to be enough for those of us who have that debt in order to have the education and the experience to be able to even qualify for that type of job.
Karina.
One thing, Claudia really hit it on the head with thinking about like the inequity around who can even afford to work those jobs. That's a whole thing in itself that we could talk about probably for hours on end that institutionally needs to change. In addition to that, when it comes to people saying they don't want these jobs, they look at their applicant pool and they're like, oh, these are all white people. They must not want these jobs. James, you brought up who knows about the positions, right? Number one. But then secondly, oftentimes people from places like where I'm from, inner city, large city, not really seeing professionals in outdoor recreation or wildlife management or any of that. I had a desire to work in the field. I just had no idea what I needed to do to get there, right? So investing, having a long game perspective and investing in people's awareness of what it takes to be something, right? There's not a lack of interest. Many times there's a lack of access. Many times there's a lack of information being passed on. So if you are an entity of state park, again, thinking about community relationships, making the resources that you have available in your institution, again, whether it's money or it's knowledge, it's information, and making that, being intentional to go to the communities and making that available in the ways that are most relevant so that young people who might be in grade school, might be in high school, might be thinking about college or not, know what they need to do to then, once it's time to apply for the job, have the tools they need. Because again, you can't just think, all right, we're going to post this job on the HBCU, you know what I mean? And then think you fixed it. It is a long-term process that has several institutional layers that need to be addressed, including preparing young people, including paying your workers enough to be able to survive as an employee at your job. So I just wanted to add that to what Claudia had mentioned. Thank you, Claudia.
No, well said. I mean, I've heard it said that most outdoor organizations don't recruit, they announce. You know, so essentially the presumption is that all they've got to do is put the word out and they will get the applicants that they typically will. And typically what happens is they get the same type of applicants that they've always gotten. And it's really not going to be until they've gone out of their way to find organizations or institutions like historically Black colleges, for example, that are cranking out well-educated, well-trained, very professional individuals who could take on most jobs. But even then it's complicated because, you know, you need to build relationships again. Organizations that I've worked with, Karina, you're probably familiar with the Green and Youth Foundation based in Atlanta. You know, one of the things that they do is they recruit and help to retain young people of color to work in these very specific fields of expertise. And it's only until we take the time to create an environment where they will not only be recruited, but retained and given the tools that they need to be successful that we're going to see this longitudinal change. Anything else to add before we move on to the next question?
If I could just add one little detail to that point of, you could have the best trained, highest qualified, most enthusiastic human being on the planet. But if the community or the organization doesn't support that person being there, and I don't mean just financially, right? Financially, that'll get them there. But and I had this conversation when it came to wardens working in the Northwoods. If you have a warden of color who is posted to a community that has been historically and still to this day is very proud of being a very small town, very small-minded, and I'm just going to say that out loud. I mean, this is who we are and this is what we stand for, and we don't want any outsiders here. No matter how hard you recruit and no matter how high you pay that person, that will not be a sustainable partnership or relationship or community for that matter. So I think that those are also things that need to be looked at from an institutional perspective. And to Karina's point, and to, I mean, again, we're just repeating a lot of the same things. So I don't want to sound like I'm coming up with new ideas here because y'all have already said these things. So I appreciate you for that. But I think that that's one of the conversations that needs to continue to happen along with all of these smaller focused pieces, which is if the organization, if the institution, or if the society as a whole is not supportive, then that is where we really need to work in conjunction and at the same time, right? We want to get folks interested in these things. We want to offer access to the education, to the resources, to those things in order for them to be in those spaces. But if they arrive and those spaces are still insanely hostile, if those spaces are still not just not welcoming, but intentionally and actively prohibitive, then yes, then that argument that says nobody applied is always going to be a good excuse, because nobody wants to, because it is not an inviting space for them, for us, for whomever, to show up and to actually take up that space.
James, you're muted.
I did it again, sorry about that. As a person of color who has many oppressed identities, it is very difficult for me to feel safe or comfortable in the outdoors. I want to feel more comfortable, but it's hard to. What steps would you recommend taking? How, as people of color, can we be made to, what can we do ourselves to make ourselves more comfortable in outdoor settings?
I'm gonna do my best to make this a very quick answer because I've talked way too much so far. I would say seeing the faces in this panel is one way of doing that. Reaching out to organizations and individuals that are hosting events, that are doing things in the name of and in partnership and collaboration with folks who are wanting people that look like them, that are like them, that live in places like they do, et cetera, to go out and enjoy these spaces, because there can be safety in numbers. And I think that to have that supportive allyship and partnership, and having folks that look and have the same interests as you, can be a very good start and welcoming start to be able to eventually then journey out and take up space, period. But having that safe and welcoming environment in which to start out doing that, I think is incredibly important. So to that point, if you haven't seen the list that already exists, and if you haven't listened to some of the folks up here, I have to admit, I'm totally fanning on both what Karina and Claudia are doing. And so it's really awesome to finally be able to have the honor of sitting on this panel with them, but I cannot say enough about what they're already doing. And so to that point, there are individuals and organizations like that all over the country that are doing these types of things, and definitely to tap into those resources.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of the work that's being done with affinity groups is meant to directly respond to this question. How do we make people feel more comfortable in the outdoors? And I think a big part of that is being able to have the comfort of shared experience, to be in an environment where people know that they will be, not only accepted, but encouraged to participate in these things. And unfortunately, that's not always something that we can do ourselves, as individuals. And so being able to have the institutional commitment and assistance is key to all of this, because we really don't have the capacity to keep ourselves safe in an environment that we're completely unfamiliar with. And what do? We decide to stay at home. We don't go outside. We won't have those positive experiences. And so I think that it clearly is an opportunity for us all to be able to look out for each other and hopefully give people the experiences that they want and need. I think we've got time for one more really good question, and I'm going to scroll through. And in the meantime, I want to thank everyone for being here and the time that we have remaining. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge that the Antiracism in the Outdoors resource guide was created by colleagues at the University of Connecticut, as well as Cornell University, with the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'd like to see if we can, end on a positive note. In the time that we have remaining, I'd be very curious to know from each of you, how can we take what we've learned today and what we're talking about and continue this? And we kind of brushed on this before in terms of what can we look forward to in the future. But what can we do today? I mean, like it'll be about lunchtime in most communities around the country. What can we do in the next 24 hours to achieve positive change? Something that we might not have done before, but something that we can do today and maybe commit to in the coming month of October. Here we're rolling into the fall leaf and birding season. Fly fishing season is coming to an end. What can we do as individuals right now to make positive, proactive change today?
I think what I'll say is leaning on what I've said before about building community. If you're an institution or if you're simply an individual, kind of figuring out what you can do, especially if you're of the dominant culture, if you're a white person who's trying to navigate what to do, go to the places where people are organized around addressing inequities that they are facing, and position yourself to listen, build a relationship with someone, be someone that person can depend on, right? Learn from them. And as you learn, as you sit, as you listen, as you get to know that person and the community that they come from, you will become more informed about the ways that you can have local impacts, can locally contribute to the work that's being done, always seeking to follow the lead of that community, not the lead of what you feel like instinctually might be the best action to take, but that takes you positioning yourself to be a friend, to build a relationship. So the thing that you can do today is to figure out how you can get to know people. That's my recommendation.
I love that. Thank you, Karina. And yes, relationship is key. And so look at the relationships you have and the opportunities that exist within your own life. I know that a lot of the folks that are probably on here serve in some sort of volunteer capacity, and maybe it's perhaps on a board, and maybe be the rabble rouser and ask, hey, have we thought about recruiting for a board position in the community rather than just tapping into the same old networks that we're always tapping into. So be that person who is asking those kinds of questions. And if you get pushback, send them the link to this presentation and have people really change their perspective and be able to address why it is important that we are looking beyond just what we have always done, who we have always had represented on the board, or who we have always had in positions of looking at the betterment for our ecosystem and environment and preservation of those nature spaces, but of the people who are of the community, so that they can feel those same benefits, whether it is mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and be able to have an opportunity to bring the community to those spaces rather than feel as though the community should be coming because it is here. So addressing that gap, however it is that people can address it within their own capacity.
Chris, parting thoughts?
I just don't want to talk. These two just say such amazing things. I don't want to mess it up. I will say that, the big thing is, in my opinion, approach life with humility and come to a conversation with other folks based on the understanding that this is not about title and tenure. This is about a person's ability to communicate with you on their terms and being able to learn from them, and not to that point of what can these individuals do to work with these different groups. Don't be a backpack. Don't be that extra weight that we're already carrying, but be a hiker alongside. I'm going to use the outdoor metaphor because that's where we are, right? And you can carry the backpack yourself, and you can fill it up with all the different tools and resources and ideas and all those types of things, but really work hard at not being an additional weight. So what can we do? We can work together. We can work in harmony. We can maybe flip that table and get it out of the way so that there's nothing obstructing our ability to communicate with one another and sit in a circle, whether it's on a chair or on the ground, maybe on the ground, because again, we're talking about the outdoors, but do what we can to communicate and collaborate in a way that is organic, that's not forced, that doesn't necessarily fit the models and the molds that we're used to. But most importantly, understanding that you don't grow without a little discomfort or pain. And I think that that's something that really, really needs to be a thread that kind of is woven into any of these conversations and any of these initiatives. Is it's going to be difficult and uncomfortable, but at the end, that growth will end in dividends, in the long scheme. So thank you for that.
Excellent. And thank you, each of my panelists, Karina, Claudia, Chris, and also thank you to my colleagues, Don Rakow and Laura Brown. Also, thank you to my colleague, Emily Reynolds at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. I'm James Edward Mills of the Joycher Project. And if you've enjoyed this conversation today, it will be available on YouTube. And we'll hopefully have that video up shortly. All of your questions have been gathered and collected, and through the course of the next several weeks, we'll be continuing to answer these questions. And just check out a couple of posts that I will be including on my website, joychairproject.com, and we'll continue this conversation to make sure that we indeed have a diverse, equitable, and inclusive outdoor recreation industry, and also an environmental movement. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the weekend, and get outside. Goodbye, everyone.